Deep in the Dragon Ball universe, certain stories do not arrive with fury or fire. They come quietly, carrying the grief of people who were never given the chance to survive. The Baby Vegeta Saga is that kind of story. It follows a creature born from the last remaining cells of the Tuffle race, crossing the stars in search of those who destroyed his people, the Saiyans. Slow, ancient, and unlike anything that came before, this is where we drift tonight. Before drifting off, you can subscribe for more quiet Dragon Ball stories, and let me know where you're listening from tonight, as the chapter opens on the rain-colored surface of Planet M2, where the dust of the machine mutant battles had barely begun to settle, and the world around the Grand Tour spaceship still held the memory of the chaos that had just passed through it. Planet M2 was a cold and mechanical place. It was a world made of interlocking gears and reinforced steel corridors, a planet that functioned less like a living world and more like an enormous breathing engine. Even its sky carried a quality of metal to it, the kind of gray that did not shift with weather but simply remained, pressing down like the ceiling of something much older than the civilization that built it. The battles that had unfolded across its surface had left marks that such a place could not easily absorb. There were grooves in the earth where energy blasts had carved long trenches. There were shadows that had no object to cast them, burned into the landscape by forces that had passed through too quickly to leave anything more permanent behind. And yet, in the middle of all of that aftermath, something was already beginning to move. Jiru, the small mechanical companion who had traveled alongside Goku, Trunks, and Pan on their journey across the stars, had used his unique technical nature to help restore the Grand Tour spaceship to its proper condition. The spaceship had been transformed during the events that brought the group to Planet M2, warped by the influence of the machine mutants who claimed that world as their own. Giru worked quietly, as he often did when the situation asked for steadiness rather than flash, and slowly the ship returned to its recognizable shape, hull by panel, system by system. The surrounding metal on the planet's surface was also affected by his efforts, as though the restoration of the ship had sent a small ripple outward into the mechanical landscape itself. It was a modest kind of order being restored to a place that had lost it, and for a brief moment, as the ship hummed back to life, there was something close to peace on the surface of Planet M2. The group gathered themselves and prepared for takeoff. There was a sense of relief among them, not the loud, celebrating kind, but the quieter kind, the kind that comes after a long effort has concluded and the weight of it is only now fully felt. Goku stood near the entrance of the ship, smaller than his natural self due to the effects of the Black Star Dragon Balls that had reduced him to the body of a child, but no less present in his bearing, no less steady in the way he held the moment around him. Trunks was there as well, composed in the way that the son of Vegeta learned to be composed, even when things had not gone cleanly. And Pan, the youngest of the group, already carried more experience of genuine danger in her than most people twice her age. Together, they moved to take their places and leave this mechanical planet behind. But something held the ship in place. It was not an equipment failure, and it was not a technical difficulty with the restoration Jiru had performed. It was something outside the ship entirely, something that had reached up from the surface of Planet M2 and was gripping the vessel with a force that did not intend to let it rise. Looking through the ship's window, Goku and the others saw General Rildo, the commander of the machine mutant forces, a being of immense mechanical power who had proven himself to be one of the most formidable opponents they had faced on this entire journey. Rildo had the ability to manipulate the metal of Planet M2 itself, drawing upon the very substance of the world around him to reshape his form and extend his reach to extraordinary lengths. He had used this ability throughout the battles that brought the group here, and he was using it now, wrapping the ship in a grip born from the planet's own metallic nature. There was a stillness in the moments before the response came. The group inside the ship exchanged looks that did not need words to carry their meaning. Then Goku, Trunks, and Pan moved together toward the exterior of the vessel, positioning themselves and drawing upon the energy they carried within them. What followed was a Kamehameha not from one warrior alone, but from multiple hands firing in the same direction at the same moment, the combined wave of energy striking Rildo in his regular form with a force that left no ambiguity about the outcome. The machine general was destroyed, his grip on the ship releasing in the same moment that his form came apart. The ship began to rise, and it was then, in the aftermath of that destruction, in the smoke and scattered debris that Rildo left behind, that something emerged from the broken pieces of his body. It was small at first, barely visible against the dust and the cold light of Planet M2's steel sky. A tiny, larval form, pale and quiet and entirely still for just a moment before it began to move with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental about it. It was a being that had been waiting inside General Rildo, using the machine general as a vehicle, a temporary vessel that had served its purpose and was now no longer needed. This creature had not been destroyed with Rildo. It had not been caught in the wave of energy that swept the general away. It had survived as it would prove itself capable of surviving again and again throughout the saga that was only now beginning to unfold. His name was Baby, and as the Grand Tour spaceship climbed away from the surface of Planet M2, Baby slipped away into the cold and the distance, carrying everything he had come to carry, every fragment of a civilization's memory. Every wound of a people who had been exterminated before they could leave any record of themselves that the universe would remember. Every drop of a grievance so deep and so old that it had outlasted the bodies of every individual who first felt it. The great search had only just begun. Tololo, once in space, the group settled back into the rhythm that had defined their journey since long before the events on Planet M2. They were looking for the Black Star Dragon Balls, those scattered ancient spheres whose existence had set this entire adventure in motion. The Black Star Dragon Balls were not the ordinary Dragon Balls that the Z-Fighters had spent so much of their history seeking and summoning. They were an older creation, made in the time before the Dragon Balls most people knew were forged, carrying a power that was greater in some ways and more dangerous in others. When a wish was made upon them, they scattered across the entire galaxy rather than across a single planet. And if they were not all gathered and returned to Earth within the span of 1 year, the planet where the wish had been made would be destroyed. Earth's clock was already ticking. It had been ticking since the beginning of this journey. Giru was the group's most reliable instrument for detecting the presence of Dragon Ball energy across the vast distances of space, and he set to work almost immediately after their departure from Planet M2. There was still a number of the Black Star Dragon Balls unaccounted for, and the group could not afford to linger in orbit around any world longer than the search demanded. Space opened around the ship in every direction, dark and immense, and largely silent, the kind of silence that does not feel empty, so much as full of distance, full of the space between things that have not yet encountered each other. It was into this silence that Giru sent his scanning senses, and it was out of this silence that the first signal returned. One of the Dragon Balls was nearby, but the path to it was not simple, as paths in this part of the galaxy rarely seemed to be. What Giru detected was not the Dragon Ball resting on a planet's surface or sealed within some accessible location. It was aboard a derelict spacecraft, a starship that had long since been abandoned by whoever had crewed it, now drifting through the outer reaches of a sun's gravitational field, slowly being drawn toward its inevitable end. The ship was in the final stages of a long, patient descent toward the star below, and the time remaining before it would be consumed by the sun's corona was measured not in hours but in minutes. Goku, Trunks, and Pan had to act quickly if they were going to reach the Dragon Ball before the ship and everything aboard it was reduced to nothing. They used space scooters, small agile vehicles stored aboard the Grand Tour ship, to cross the distance between the two vessels. The derelict ship loomed before them as they approached, its hull darkened and pitted from years of exposure to the radiative environment near the star, its systems long since failed and silent. There was something somber about it, about the way it simply drifted without direction or purpose, unable to resist the slow pull that was bringing it to its end. They boarded carefully, making their way through corridors that held no light of their own, and began their search for the Dragon Ball. They found it in the engine room, The one star ball rested there among the silent machinery of the abandoned ship, its single star visible even in the low light of the dying vessel. Trunks secured it carefully, and the group prepared to return the way they came. There was no time for anything else. The ship's descent toward the sun had not slowed simply because they had boarded it, and the danger had not paused to accommodate their search. They moved back through the corridors toward their exit. It was Pan who stopped them. She had noticed something moving in one of the rooms they were passing, a presence that none of them had registered consciously, but that she had caught in the corner of her awareness. Pan was someone who paid attention to things at the edge of certainty rather than waiting for them to become obvious, and this particular instinct of hers had served the group well before. She insisted on investigating even as the ship continued its slow, inevitable drift toward the sun, even as the time remaining continued to diminish. The thing that had been moving was a machine monster, an automated defensive system of some kind, one of the last operational pieces of the abandoned ship, programmed to protect the vessel against intruders. It turned its attention toward Pan and launched a barrage of missiles. Goku and Trunks moved without hesitation, intercepting the projectiles before they could reach her, their combined effort keeping the attack from its intended target. Pan responded in turn, finding a keyblade nearby and using it to disable the machine, a straightforward, decisive solution to what had briefly seemed like a complication. The machine's systems went dark. And then, Giru detected something else. Not metal, not machinery, not a Dragon Ball, but something biological. A life sign, faint and irregular, somewhere deeper in the ship. The group exchanged a glance and went to investigate, and what they found there stopped all of them with equal parts surprise and uncertainty. A boy. He appeared young, perhaps no older than Pan in visible years, with hair the color of summer grass and a face that was completely still in the way of someone who has not yet fully returned to consciousness. He was alive, but just barely, and the ship around him had perhaps minutes left before it entered the corona of the star below. There was no time for deliberation, and no time for the kind of patient consideration that would normally surround such a discovery in safer circumstances. The group had to act on the simple fact that there was a living person here who would die if they left him behind. They carried him out. The scooters were waiting where they had left them, and the escape seemed straightforward at first. But the sun had not stopped pulling. As the group mounted their scooters and pushed away from the derelict ship's hull, they felt the same gravitational drag that had been claiming the abandoned vessel begin to make its claim on them. The scooters were not powerful enough to fully resist it. The pull tightened around them, slowing their progress away from the star, holding them in a relationship with the sun that was beginning to feel less like a near miss and more like a trajectory. They abandoned the scooters. Jiru launched a grappling hook toward the Grand Tour ship, which Goku had kept within reach at a safer distance from the star. The hook caught, and the group gathered together in space. Pan, Trunks, Goku, the unconscious green-haired boy, holding on to each other in the way people hold on to each other when the alternative is drifting into a sun. Then Goku drew upon the energy inside him, positioning himself and his companions, and fired a Kamehameha, aimed not at an enemy this time, but used as propulsion, the blast pushing all of them together away from the sun's hold and back toward the waiting ship. It was a solution that required precision as much as power, the kind of moment that made the distinction between those two qualities very clear, and it worked. They made it back aboard the Grand Tour ship, all of them, including the boy. Lo, the boy was badly injured, and the nature of those injuries was unclear enough that none of the group could fully assess what he needed or how serious his condition was. Giru sent out an emergency distress signal into the surrounding space, broadcasting a call for assistance that carried their coordinates along with the basic information about the medical situation they were dealing with. The response came back with coordinates, a location called Planet Pital, a world specifically associated with medical facilities and the treatment of the injured and ill. It was the right place for a situation like this, and the group changed course immediately. Planet Pital had a quality of stillness to it that fit the purpose it served. It was not a dramatic world, not the kind of planet that announced itself with vast landscapes or striking geographical features. It was quiet in the way that places of healing tend to be quiet, a deliberate, maintained quiet designed to allow recovery rather than to simply reflect an absence of activity. Its facilities were advanced, its staff professional and attentive, and the green haired boy was taken into the emergency center almost immediately upon their arrival, rushed through the care systems of the hospital before the group had fully caught their breath from the journey to get there. Goku, Trunks, and Pan settled in to wait. This kind of waiting was different from the waiting that came before battles. It was not the charged, energetic anticipation of a confrontation about to begin. It was the kind of waiting that asks something slower of a person: patience, quiet, the willingness to sit with uncertainty for as long as uncertainty requires. The medical team worked behind closed doors, and the group received brief updates that told them the boy was being stabilized, that the immediate danger seemed to be receding. There was, briefly, something close to relief in the atmosphere of the waiting room. And then the monitor changed. The readings on the medical equipment tracking the boy's condition shifted into a pattern that none of the trained staff of Planet Pital's facility had seen before. It was not the pattern of a patient stabilizing. It was not the pattern of someone whose condition was improving under care. It was something that the instruments could detect, but could not fully interpret. An anomalous signature that did not match any of the known biological profiles the hospital systems were calibrated to recognize. The medical team investigated. Except for a single nurse who had remained in the room to monitor the equipment, everyone else stepped away to consult and examine the unusual data. The boy's face changed. It was a subtle thing at first, the kind of change that might have been dismissed as a trick of the light or the natural shift of someone moving in and out of consciousness. But it was not that. The expression that settled across the boy's face was not the expression of a patient resting or recovering from exhaustion. It was something deliberate and knowing, a smile that carried no warmth of its own, a smile that belonged to something entirely separate from the unconscious child it was appearing on. The nurse had no time to process what she was seeing before the room erupted. The explosion ripped through the hospital room, violently and without warning, the force of it carrying the quality of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to release itself. The nurse was the target. The blast was designed not to destroy the facility, but to eliminate the one witness closest to what had just occurred. And in the immediate aftermath, when Goku and the others came running toward the sound of the blast, what they found was smoke and wreckage, and through the smoke, a figure moving that should not have been moving. Goku reacted immediately, crossing the distance to where the figure was and pulling the boy's current host, a nearby staff member, to safety before the situation could escalate further. The medical team responded to the chaos and returned the boy to care, intent on continuing the treatment that the disruption had interrupted. But everyone who had been present for what happened carried the same clear knowledge, unspoken but shared between them. There was something inside this boy that was not the boy himself. Something that had survived, something that was not finished. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Poor Baby's nature. The creature that had been moving through the green-haired boy had a history that stretched back much further than the abandoned starship where Goku's group had found him. It had a history that stretched back, in fact, to one of the most violent and consequential events in Saiyan history, an event that had shaped the nature of the Saiyan race as surely as any battle they had ever fought, and that had created a wound in the fabric of one civilization's story that had never properly healed. To understand Baby is to understand the Tuffles. The Tuffles were an ancient people who had once shared Planet Vegeta, the homeworld of the Saiyans, with those warrior beings who would one day become some of the most powerful fighters in the universe. The Tuffles were not a warrior race. They were scientists and engineers, builders of technology and students of the biological and mechanical sciences, a people whose greatest achievements were found not on the battlefield but in their laboratories and in the intricate systems they devised to make their civilization function. They were sophisticated in ways that the Saiyans of their era were not, refined in ways that the raw, battle-hungry culture of the Saiyan people did not value and could not fully comprehend. The two races had coexisted on the same planet for a very long time, but coexistence had always been uneasy, and the balance between the technologically advanced Tuffles and the physically powerful Saiyans was never truly stable. The Saiyans looked at the Tuffles and saw a people who occupied space that could be theirs. The Tuffles looked at the Saiyans and saw a danger that their technology alone might not be enough to manage indefinitely. For a long time, some version of this tension held without completely rupturing. Then it ruptured. The Saiyan-Tuffle War, as it came to be known in the records that survived it, was a conflict that ended not in negotiation or compromise, but in the complete and utter extermination of one of the two peoples involved. The Saiyans, drawing upon the power granted to them by a rare alignment of their planet's full moons, transformed en masse into the enormous, nearly unstoppable great ape forms that represented the upper limit of their racial power at the time. In that state, the raw combat capability of the Saiyan people overwhelmed everything the Tuffle technology could produce in defense. The Tuffles fought with everything they had. It was not enough. Their civilization, their cities, their history, their art, their science, everything that they had built over generations was consumed in the fires of that war, and the people who had built it were gone. The Saiyans renamed the planet. They called it Planet Vegeta. But one Tuffle scientist had worked in the final period before the fall on a project intended to carry forward what his people could not carry forward through survival. His name was Dr. Miu in some accounts, though the records of the exact circumstances of Baby's creation varied between sources. What is consistent is the intent behind the project. Using the most advanced biotechnology the Tuffle scientists had ever developed, this last scientist created Baby, a being constructed from the compiled genetic material and cellular data of the Tuffle race, an artificial life form designed to carry with him not just the memory, but the literal biological substance of every Tuffle who had ever lived. Baby was made to be a vessel for the totality of the Tuffle people's existence, compressed and refined into a form capable of survival, and given a single, consuming purpose. That purpose was revenge. Baby was not born in the ordinary sense. He was created, grown in conditions of scientific precision, and filled with a kind of knowledge that went deeper than anything that could be taught. It was a knowledge inscribed into his very cellular structure, a knowledge of loss and of the specific source of that loss, an orientation toward a target that was not chosen so much as woven into the fabric of what he was. The Saiyans who had destroyed the Tuffles were the ones Baby existed to confront. And while many of those Saiyans had themselves been destroyed long before Baby was ever fully formed, Planet Vegeta annihilated by Frieza, the Saiyan race reduced to a handful of survivors scattered across the universe, the ones who remained, were enough. Because Baby did not simply intend to fight the Saiyans, he intended to become them. His method was possession, the ability to enter a host's body through a wound, to take control of the nervous system from the inside, to use the host's strength and memories and physical form as his own, while gradually layering his own will over everything the host had been. The more hosts he passed through, the stronger he became, absorbing something from each body he occupied, growing more fully developed with each transfer. It was a strategy as patient as it was disturbing, and it was designed to culminate in a very specific endgame: the possession of the most powerful Saiyan alive, and, through that possession, the domination of everything the Saiyans had ever touched. He had already been moving in that direction long before Goku, Trunks, and Pan had ever found the green-haired boy near the dying starship. Baby had been inside General Rildo on Planet M2, not as a prisoner but as a passenger, biding his time, waiting for the correct moment to emerge and pursue the path he had been designed to follow. The emergence from Rildo's destroyed body was not a defeat, it was a continuation. Baby was, in the most fundamental sense of the word, persistent, not out of stubbornness or pride, but out of a nature that had been calibrated specifically to resist the kind of destruction that would end any ordinary being. So long as a single cell of him remained, he could reconstitute himself, rebuild himself, continue moving toward the purpose that had been inscribed into his first moment of existence. The hospital on Planet Piddle was merely the next staging ground. Pan had a quality of stillness about her when she explored alone that was different from the stillness she showed in battle. It was an observant, curious stillness, the kind that slowed a person's footsteps not because they were cautious, but because they did not want to disturb whatever they were moving toward. It was in one of these unhurried moments that she came across a young deer on the hospital grounds, standing near the edge of one of the quieter sections of the facility's exterior, entirely undisturbed by the activity that the arrival of their group had brought to Planet Piddle. Pan watched the deer for a moment, with the simple pleasure of someone encountering something gentle, in the middle of a story that had not been especially gentle. The green-haired boy appeared. He came toward her quietly, as children approach things when they are curious rather than purposeful, and he initiated a conversation with a naturalness that did not immediately suggest anything unusual about his presence. He was supposed to be resting. He was supposed to be under the care of the hospital staff, recovering from the injuries that had brought him there in the first place. But here he was, speaking with Pan in the garden area outside, as though none of that was relevant, his eyes carrying a quality that Pan, who was perceptive in the way that granddaughters of Goku often were, noticed without being able to immediately name. Baby had been watching all of them. His use of the boy's body as a vehicle was temporary by design. Temporary because the boy was not Saiyan, and therefore not the kind of vessel that Baby's design had called for. He had used the boy to arrive at Planet Pital, to observe the group from a safe distance, to begin the process of understanding the landscape of the situation before committing to his next move. But he had been preparing that next move since the moment the explosion rocked the hospital room, since the moment Goku had carried the staff member to safety through the smoke, since the moment the group had revealed, through their responses to that chaos, exactly how alert they were and exactly how they organized themselves when danger appeared. The encounter in the garden was cut short when Goku and Trunks arrived. The green-haired boy adjusted his demeanor smoothly, became again what he appeared to be, a recovering patient who had perhaps wandered outside in a moment of restless energy. And one of the hospital's doctors appeared as well, suggesting gently that the boy ought to return to his room and continue resting. The group watched the boy and the doctor move back inside, and in the easy rhythm of that return, Baby completed the first step of a plan he had been assembling very carefully. He changed hosts. The transfer from the boy to the doctor was precise and swift, the kind of movement that happened in the space between one noticed moment and the next, visible in retrospect, but not in the instant of its occurrence. The doctor who walked back inside the facility with the green-haired boy was no longer entirely the doctor. Baby now wore the physician's body and the physician's authority, and both of those things were immediately useful. As a medical professional, he had access to every area of the hospital. He had the trust of the staff. He had the ability to move between different groups of people without drawing attention, to suggest things that would be accepted without excessive questioning. He instructed a nurse to return the boy to his room, and then he turned his attention to the group. What followed was a strategy of separation. Baby, using the doctor's knowledge of the facility and the doctor's social credibility, found ways to divide Goku, Trunks, and Pan from each other. Small suggestions, natural-seeming invitations, the kind of gentle maneuvering that is only visible for what it is when examined from the outside. Goku was encouraged to go inside and eat, a suggestion whose effectiveness relied entirely on Goku's well-documented relationship with food and the anxiety he carried about receiving medical injections. The prospect of a meal was enough to send him in one direction while the others were directed elsewhere. Trunks, who had shown genuine fascination with the advanced technology of the Planet Piddle Hospital, was offered a tour. The tour moved through the facility with the pace of genuine interest, stopping at equipment and explaining systems in enough detail to engage someone with an engineer's curiosity and a Saiyan's directness. Trunks followed with the kind of focused attention he gave to things that genuinely captured him. the kind that did not leave much room at its edges for the awareness of surrounding context. The final stop on the tour was a giant microscope, an instrument of extraordinary precision that allowed its viewer to see electrons in motion, to observe matter at the most fundamental level of its structure. Trunks leaned forward into the viewfinder, and Baby chose that moment. The grip came first, a hand around the throat, a pressure that was clinical in its precision, applied with the kind of efficiency that belonged to something that had planned this moment carefully and was now executing the plan without hesitation. Trunks was caught, genuinely caught, in the way that even a Saiyan warrior can be caught when their attention is elsewhere and the attack comes from inside the trusted perimeter. The doctor's voice was no longer the doctor's voice. Baby identified himself. He told Trunks with a directness that carried the weight of everything he was and everything he had been built to be, that he could not be destroyed so long as a single one of his cells survived. It was not a boast. It was simply true. And Baby stated it the way one states a fact about the weather, with neither pride nor apology, only the flat certainty of someone describing the actual conditions of reality as they exist. He had been in the doctor's body. He had been in the boy's body before that. He had been in General Rildo's body before that. He would be in Trunks's body next. Paul lo lo. The attempt came with speed, and it almost succeeded. Baby began the process of entering Trunks, pressing toward that threshold between the outer world and the interior of a host body where possession becomes possible, where the will of one entity begins to overwrite the will of another. Trunks fought the intrusion with everything his Saiyan biology instinctively brought to bear against something foreign and hostile entering his system. But Baby was not a simple attacker. He was a being specifically engineered for this kind of contact, and the difficulty of resisting him was unlike the difficulty of resisting a punch or an energy blast. Goku and Pan arrived. They came through the door of the room where the giant microscope stood, having picked up on the signature of Baby's energy in the moments before the attempt began. They had been watching, Goku explained, not openly, not in a way that Baby would have detected, but in the subtle way that warriors who have trained their senses past ordinary limits watch for things that exist at the edge of perception. Since arriving on Planet Pittel, the group had been aware that something was using the hospital's environment to observe them. They had allowed themselves to appear vulnerable. Goku reluctant to enter the building, the group separated and seemingly easy to isolate, specifically to draw whatever was watching them into an attempt that could be interrupted. Baby heard this explanation with something that was not quite surprise, because Baby was not a being easily surprised. But the situation had shifted in a way that required adjustment. The attempt to take Trunks directly and quietly had been interrupted. He was now exposed, known, standing in a medical room on a planet that was not his target, and facing 3 Saiyan-blooded warriors who were fully aware of what he was. He went on the offensive. The energy Baby released in that room was destructive in the way that trapped things release energy when they have no other option. Not controlled, not strategic, but genuinely violent and difficult to contain. He was not fully developed yet. He had not had the opportunity to pass through enough bodies of sufficient power to reach the level he was designed to eventually attain. But even in this partial state, what he produced was enough to cut Trunks on his arm, drawing the kind of wound that Baby needed. A wound that served as a gateway, a small but sufficient opening through which his cellular form could move from the exterior of the body to the interior. He entered through the cut. Goku saw it happening and prepared an energy blast, but stopped. The problem was Trunks' body. Any attack strong enough to remove Baby from Trunks would not distinguish between Baby and the person Baby was now occupying. Goku could not fire without risking the death of his companion's son, and Baby understood this, had counted on it in fact, because this kind of calculus was exactly the kind of constraint that his possession strategy was designed to exploit. He was protected in those first moments inside Trunks by the care the people around him had for the body he was using. But Trunks fought back from the inside. Saiyan biology, when pushed to its absolute edge of resistance, can produce responses that exceed what its normal baseline suggests. Trunks pushed against the presence inside him with everything he had, and what he had, in that moment of maximum need, was more than it might have appeared from the outside. Something in him surged. The energy inside him built and shifted and crested in a way that was unmistakable to anyone watching from outside the room. He was going Super Saiyan. The golden energy of that transformation filled the room, and with it came a force that pushed back against Baby's occupation of his body with a ferocity that Baby, for all his preparation and design, had not fully anticipated. Baby was expelled. The transformation had driven the invader out, and Trunks, shaking, breathing hard, his body still carrying the residue of the fight that had just happened inside it, stood in his Super Saiyan state and added his energy to Goku and Pan's, all three of them now aimed at a single target. But Baby had already started moving. The attack he used to escape was one the group had seen before. A flash, intense and disorienting, similar in its effect to a solar flare, temporarily blinding the three warriors with the kind of white-out intensity that strips away the visual field completely for just long enough. When it cleared, Baby was gone. He had moved into the corridor, and then into the crowd of travelers and hospital personnel moving toward departing spaceships, and he had inserted himself into an innocent person, a woman boarding one of those ships, so completely and so quickly that Goku's senses, precise as they were, could no longer locate him within the mass of non-threatening energy signatures around them. Baby was gone from Planet Piddle, and the group had no way to follow. They had no choice but to return to their original mission. The Black Star Dragon Balls were still out there, still unsecured, and the clock tied to them had not stopped ticking simply because this confrontation had occurred. Goku, Trunks, and Pan boarded the Grand Tour spaceship and continued the search, carrying with them the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, a being of ancient and specific grievance was moving toward Earth by whatever path was available to him, growing stronger with every host he occupied along the way. Lo. The spaceship that Baby had entered as a passenger was not carrying him to any destination that had been chosen for it before he arrived. By the time the ship was at a safe distance from Planet Petal's orbit, everyone aboard it was under Baby's control, or had been eliminated. He moved through the vessel with the efficiency of something that had no interest in preserving what did not serve his purpose, possessing each person he encountered and growing incrementally stronger with each transfer, each new body adding its organic contribution to the sum of what Baby was becoming. He set a course for Earth. Earth was where the Saiyans were. Earth was where the descendants and companions of the race that had destroyed his people now lived their lives protected by the relative peace of an era that had cost many battles to achieve. Earth was where Goku had made his home, where Gohan had grown up, where Vegeta had settled into something that looked from the outside like a life. Earth was the only destination that had ever mattered to Baby, and every path he had taken since his emergence from General Rildo's body had been oriented toward that single point in space. While Baby traveled, the ordinary concerns of Earth continued in the way ordinary concerns continue even when something is approaching that will interrupt them. Goten, the younger son of Goku, a young man by this point in Dragon Ball GT's timeline, was on his way to meet a girl named Valise. Valise was kind and entirely unaware of the world that Goten moved through when he was not in her company. A world of energy and training, an ancient conflict that bore no resemblance to the ordinary days she experienced. Goten had a quality of easy naturalness about him that allowed him to inhabit both of those worlds without difficulty, to be the son of Goku in training and the young man trying to make a good impression with equal sincerity. He was going on a date, and the ordinariness of that fact is worth noting because ordinariness of exactly that kind was about to become very difficult to maintain. Elsewhere, Bulma and Chi-Chi had been tracking the passing of time with a kind of careful attention that comes from caring deeply about people who are not present. Nearly a year had elapsed since Goku's group had departed Earth in search of the Black Star Dragon Balls. The window for collecting them and returning safely was shrinking. Both women understood the mathematics of the situation with perfect clarity, even if neither of them spoke about it directly in every conversation. The Earth was under a deadline. and the people responsible for meeting that deadline were somewhere out in the galaxy, still searching. Worry is a particular kind of patience, one that does not have the luxury of directing itself toward anything productive. It simply waits and watches and counts the days. The situation on Earth shifted without warning when an explosion ripped through one of its cities. A detonation that seemed at first to be random, the kind of violence without clear origin that draws emergency services and crowds of observers and the general human response to sudden destruction. But this explosion was not random. It was Baby, having arrived on Earth and beginning to move through its population with the same methodical purpose he had applied to every step of his journey. He had taken on a muscular human form, and he moved through the streets using that form's appearance as cover, searching for the specific energy signatures he had been calibrated to find. He was looking for the Saiyans. Hercule, the Earth's celebrated martial arts champion, the man who had been publicly credited with the defeat of Cell during the Cell Games many years before, a figure of enormous popular reputation and diminished actual combat capability, encountered what appeared to be an unusually violent individual in the middle of the chaos and moved toward it with the instinct that had always defined his relationship with situations that exceeded his actual capabilities. He was older now than he had been during the era of his greatest public triumphs. His physical condition, while still respectable for a man of his age and background, was no longer what it had been. He tried to intervene. The attempt was not successful. Goten arrived. He came to the scene with the awareness that something genuinely dangerous was happening. Dangerous in the specific, familiar way that things became dangerous when they were not simply violent, but were carrying a kind of energy that a Saiyan could detect even from across the street. Hercule, finding himself outmatched and conscious of it in the way he had always been more honest with himself about his limitations than he showed publicly, urged Goten to take over. Goten looked at what he was being asked to engage with and understood immediately that this was not an ordinary street fight. Part 8. Goten's Fall. The battle that unfolded between Goten and Baby was unlike the fights Baby had used as demonstrations before. Goten was a full Saiyan hybrid, the son of Goku and Chi-Chi, a young man who had achieved Super Saiyan status at an age so young that it had surprised even those familiar with Saiyan genetics. He had his father's instinct for combat and his father's natural ease with power, and he brought both of those qualities to bear against the being that had arrived on Earth wearing a human face. For a time, the fight was even. Goten held his own against Baby's partially developed power, and from the sidelines, Hercule watched with the particular mixture of pride and relief that always accompanied watching someone more capable handle a dangerous situation. But Goten's strength, impressive as it was not the point. The point was the wound. Baby had been watching Goten's movement patterns during the exchange with the care of something studying a system for its most efficient entry point. He released light energy attacks, not the largest ones he was capable of producing, not the devastating full-effort strikes that would come later, but targeted, measured strikes aimed at specific points on Goten's body. One of them connected, in the way Baby had intended. A cut opened on Goten's skin, small but sufficient, a threshold where the boundary between Goten and the outside world became briefly permeable. Baby entered. The transition was not announced and not visible in any way that the people observing the battle from a distance could have recognized as a transition rather than simply a pause. Goten continued to stand. He continued to breathe. But the Goten who had been fighting a moment before, the one who had arrived with the easy confidence of someone bringing genuine ability to a real threat, was no longer entirely in control of the body that bore his face. Baby now wore Goten's form like a garment that was almost the right size, close enough to move in without obvious difficulty, just large enough for what he needed it for next. He looked at Valise with eyes that were not Goten's eyes. Valise saw the change in the person she knew without being able to name what had changed, the way people sometimes sense a difference in someone they care about before they can articulate what the difference consists of. Baby Goten's manner toward her was cool and distant, not unkind exactly, but entirely without the warmth that had always characterized Goten's way of being present with her. He directed Hercule to move away, treating the older man's presence as an inconvenience rather than a concern. And then, drawing on the full map of Goten's memories, his relationships, his family, the geography of the world he had grown up in, Baby began using that map to navigate. The destination was Capsule Corporation. More specifically, Vegeta. Vegeta was the most powerful Saiyan currently on Earth. He was the prince of the Saiyan race, the last surviving member of the Saiyan royal line, a warrior of extraordinary capability who had spent years pushing himself to limits that had redefined what was possible for a member of his people. If Baby was going to fulfill the purpose he had been created for, if the possession that was intended to serve as the culmination of everything he had worked toward was going to happen, it would need to happen with Vegeta's body as the vessel. Everything that had come before, every temporary host, every partial possession, every step of the journey from Planet M2 to Planet Pital to the streets of this Earth city had been building toward this. Baby Goten moved through the familiar corridors of Goten's life toward the thing he had been designed to reach. Pot, Law, Piccolo had been meditating. There was a quality of absolute stillness that Piccolo achieved in his deepest states of concentration. A stillness that was not merely the absence of movement, but the active presence of awareness without its ordinary noise. He was Namekian, and Namekians had a particular relationship with the kind of quiet that most beings only approached at the edges of their experience. In that stillness, things that were happening elsewhere in the world could sometimes be felt rather than heard, not with the detail of information, but with the texture of wrongness, the sensation that something in the structure of the familiar had shifted in a way that required attention. Piccolo felt something was wrong. At Capsule Corporation, Chi-Chi had spent the hours since Goten's departure in the kind of productive worry that looked from the outside like ordinary household activity. She prepared food, she spoke with Bulma about logistics, she occupied herself with the things immediately around her while keeping a significant portion of her attention on the absence of a son who should have been back by now. When Gohan arrived, having heard about the fight in West City and come to check on the family, she was visibly relieved by the addition of his presence to the house, even if the relief was not the kind that fully resolved the underlying concern. Gohan settled in. He chose a room and began to make himself comfortable in it, the easy domesticity of an oldest son returning to his family's home carrying its own particular kind of warmth. He was a scholar now in addition to being a fighter, a person who had found ways to inhabit the life of the mind that his years of extreme combat experience had not diminished his capacity for. He carried that duality with a naturalness that was part of what made him specifically himself. Goten arrived. The Goten who came through the door of Capsule Corporation was wearing Goten's face, but what he communicated through both of those things was nothing that the real Goten would have communicated to his mother in that setting. He asked, immediately and without preamble, where Vegeta was. The question was not delivered with Goten's warmth or Goten's easy manner. It was delivered with the blunt directness of something that needed specific information and had no patience for the social textures that normally surrounded asking someone a question in their own home. Chi-Chi's response was exactly what it would always be. She scolded him. She told him in no uncertain terms that this was not how one entered a house, that this was not the tone in which one addressed family members, and she accompanied those words with a kind of physical emphasis that Chi-Chi had always been willing to provide when she felt the situation required it. Under ordinary circumstances, Goten would have responded to this with the sheepish, genuine contrition of someone who had been reminded that he had crossed a line. Baby Goten did not respond with anything of the kind. The interaction passed through him without landing the way it would have landed on the person whose face he was wearing. Bulma explained that Vegeta was not home. Baby Goten processed this and immediately recalibrated. If Vegeta was not here, the next most useful option was the next most powerful Saiyan in the building. Gohan was upstairs. Gohan had, at his peak, demonstrated power levels that rivaled or exceeded Vegeta's in certain configurations, And even in the quieter academic life he now lived, Gohan remained someone whose Saiyan biology had not forgotten what it was capable of. Baby Goten picked a fight with Gohan instead, moving through Capsule Corporation with an aggression that made Chi-Chi deeply confused and increasingly alarmed. The gap between the son she thought had come home and the person currently walking through her house growing wider with every exchange. Gohan looked at his younger brother and understood. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. The way Goten moved, the quality of the energy he was projecting, the thing in his eyes that was not Goten, that could not be Goten regardless of the face it was wearing. Gohan made the decision to engage, not because he wanted to hurt his brother, but because fighting back was the only way to protect the body that Baby was using from the scenario where Baby simply pressed an unchallenged possession to its conclusion. Chi-Chi, confused and insisting that her sons take their conflict somewhere other than inside the family home, watched them move outside. The battle began in the air above Capsule Corporation. Gohan held back, enormously, deliberately, with a precision of restraint that required as much skill as releasing his full power would have. The calculus was the same one Goku had faced in the microscope room. An attack powerful enough to drive Baby out could easily kill the host. So Gohan fought at the level of a fight with Goten, not a fight with what was inside Goten, and managed the situation with the care of someone operating in conditions where the most direct solution was unavailable. Baby had already seen enough. Gohan was stronger than Goten. Gohan's body would serve his purposes better than the one he was currently occupying, and the fight itself had provided the necessary conditions, the necessary cuts, the necessary openings in the boundary between interior and exterior, for the transfer that Baby had been preparing since the moment he arrived at Capsule Corporation. He moved from Goten to Gohan with the same precision and swiftness that had characterized every previous transfer, and Goten, freed from Baby's occupation, suddenly himself again and entirely uncertain about what had just happened, fell. Ta, Lo, Vegeta arrived eventually. He came to Capsule Corporation in the way Vegeta came home, not with ceremony, not with advance notice, simply present after an absence, carrying the particular quality of self-contained authority that was as constant a feature of him as any physical characteristic. He found a scene that was not the ordinary scene of his household, and he read its irregularities with the instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime in situations that required the accurate reading of threat. Baby Gohan was there. What followed was one of the strangest fights that the Z fighters had yet encountered, because it was not a fight between enemies, but between people who had known each other for years, whose relationship carried the history of battles survived together, and rivalry and genuine, if complicated, respect. Vegeta was being attacked by a person wearing Gohan's face, moving with Gohan's fighting capability, using the full measure of what Gohan could produce physically, and yet doing so in service of something that had nothing to do with Gohan himself. The other Z fighters who were present, those who had been at or near Capsule Corporation when all of this began, tried to intervene. They threw themselves into the situation with the loyalty that had always defined their response to threats to members of their circle. And for a time the fight spread across multiple fronts, but Baby had set his eyes on a single destination. The transfers that followed were not clean and were not without cost, but Baby was built for persistence above all things. He pushed through the resistance of each body he encountered, taking wounds and giving them, working toward the specific moment he had been designed to work toward for the entirety of his existence. And eventually, in the wreckage of a fight that had moved through multiple bodies and multiple locations around Capsule Corporation's grounds, Baby reached Vegeta. The possession of Vegeta was not like the possession of the others. It was not simply a matter of entry through a wound and the gradual assertion of Baby's will over the host's consciousness. Vegeta resisted with an intensity that matched or exceeded everything else Baby had encountered on his journey to this point, because Vegeta's pride and his self-concept and his will were not things that yielded in the way ordinary psychological resistance yielded. The battle inside Vegeta's body was as real, in its own way, as the physical battles that had preceded it. Baby pushed. Vegeta pushed back. The outcome was not instant and was not clean. But Baby was designed to win. When the struggle concluded, when Baby's will finally pressed through the last of Vegeta's internal resistance and established dominance over the Saiyan Prince's consciousness, what emerged from the other side was not simply Baby wearing Vegeta as he had worn Goten and Gohan. What emerged was something new. Vegeta's body was not like any other body Baby had inhabited. Its power, its Saiyan elite heritage, its years of training passed every previous limit. The physical adaptations that decades of combat at the highest levels had inscribed into every cell of Vegeta's form, all of it was now available to Baby. All of it poured into him like an ocean into a vessel that had been built specifically to hold exactly that. Baby Vegeta stood, and the world around him felt the difference. The Z fighters who had been fighting to protect Vegeta found themselves facing something they could not simply overpower. Pan, Goten, Gohan, all of those who had tried to intercept the possession process, they were not capable of stopping what Baby now represented. Baby Vegeta moved through their combined resistance with the ease of someone who had been conserving his real capabilities until this moment, until he was in a form sufficient to express them without the limitations that his previous hosts had imposed. He had reached his intended vessel. Everything else would follow from here. Pal-Law. Baby Vegeta's reign over Earth did not begin loudly. It began the way that the most thoroughgoing changes always begin. Gradually, at the level of individual minds rather than at the level of visible infrastructure, using mechanisms that could not be resisted by force because they did not attack through force. Baby had a plan that went beyond the simple domination of a planet's population through the fear of overwhelming physical power. That approach, the one Frieza had used, the one Cell had threatened, the one that relied on the submission of those who could not fight back, was not what Baby was building toward. What he wanted was not submission. What he wanted was transformation. He wanted to take the Earth, the world that the Saiyans had adopted, the world that the descendants of his people's destroyers now called home, and make it into something that the Tuffles could recognize as theirs. He wanted to restore Planet Tuffle. To accomplish this, he needed three things. He needed the compliance of Earth's population, which he achieved through a process of gradual mass possession, spreading his cellular influence through contact and transmission until a significant portion of humanity carried within them some fragment of his control. He needed the physical transformation of the planet's environment, which he began engineering through the advanced Tuffle technology that was part of his genetic inheritance, biological and mechanical systems that could reshape a world's ecology at the fundamental level. And he needed the Black Star Dragon Balls, those ancient scattered spheres that Goku's group had been working so hard to collect. Baby gathered the Black Star Dragon Balls himself. He used the resources and connections available to him through his control of Earth's population to locate and retrieve the Dragon Balls that had already been recovered by Goku's group, and he sent agents after those that had not yet been found. The Dragon Balls responded to the summons as they always responded, with the formality of immense power operating according to its own deep rules, the sky changing and the stars gathering their light for a moment outside the ordinary behavior of stars. Baby made his wish. The wish was for the restoration of the Tuffle home planet. What this meant in practice was the material transformation of Earth itself, its surfaces, its structures, the very substance of what it was made of, into something that resembled what Planet Tuffle had been before the Saiyan-Tuffle War had ended it. The process was gradual, but the familiar landscapes of Earth giving way over time to something architecturally and environmentally different, something that carried the aesthetic and structural sensibility of a civilization that had not existed for centuries, but had left its memory in the DNA of the being now directing this transformation. Earth became, in increments and then all at once, Planet Tuffle. The humans who remained on the surface lived their lives under Baby's influence, and many of them did not experience this as something being done to them against their will, because Baby's method of control was not the blunt instrument of simple domination. It was something more subtle, more like an alignment, a reorientation of perspective and priority that left the external appearance of ordinary life largely intact while adjusting the orientation of the person beneath the surface. People who were under Baby's influence continued to go about their days, continued to speak and work and inhabit their routines. But at the level of fundamental loyalty and purpose, they had been redirected toward Baby and toward the project he was building. The Z fighters who had been caught in the scope of this transformation were not exempt. Pan, Gohan, Goten, Trunks, all of them eventually fell under Baby's influence to varying degrees. Their connection to Baby's spreading network of cellular control, making them part of the structure he was building rather than independent agents opposing it. This was not a quick process and was not uniform in its effects, but the direction of the situation was clear. Baby was winning, not through the kind of decisive battle that Dragon Ball stories often built toward, but through the patient, methodical application of a strategy that did not require individual victories so much as the gradual removal of all meaningful alternatives. The world that Goku had left behind when he traveled into space to search for the Black Star Dragon Balls was no longer the world he had left. Tsi, Plo, Law, Law. Goku arrived to a planet that did not look like home. He had been away, traveling through the stars with Trunks and Pan, crossing enormous distances of space to gather the Black Star Dragon Balls where they had scattered. That journey had taken almost the entire year that the clock allowed. He had arrived back at Earth, or rather, back at what used to be Earth, with the last of the Dragon Balls secured, intending to complete the mission that would satisfy the condition that kept Earth from destroying itself. What he found instead was Planet Tuffle. He had known something was wrong before he fully processed the visual evidence of it, because a Saiyan who has trained his senses to the level Goku had trained his can feel the difference between familiar and foreign in the energy of an environment even when the visual information hasn't yet resolved. The energy of the world below him was wrong in a specific, traceable way, not random or chaotic wrong, but directed wrong, shaped by a will that had imposed itself upon it. He had felt, somewhere in the long process of returning, the echoes of what had happened here, and he had arrived with a kind of wariness that settled into him as he descended. The confrontation with Baby Vegeta was not immediate. There were others to encounter first, the people he had left behind, who were no longer exactly the people he had left behind. Pan found him, and in Pan's presence there was something mixed. The genuine relief of someone who cared about him seeing him return, tangled up with the signs of Baby's influence operating beneath the surface of her normal manner. Trunks was there as well, moving through the altered landscape of Planet Tuffle with the behavior of someone whose independence of will had been partially compromised without their complete awareness of the compromise. And then there was Baby Vegeta. The first fight between Goku and Baby Vegeta was a fight that Goku entered at a disadvantage he was not fully prepared for. He had returned from a long journey, his reserves not at their peak, his body carrying the fatigue of travel, even if his spirit was entirely present and focused. Baby Vegeta had spent months in Vegeta's body, growing more accustomed to its power, layering his own energy through it, and making it progressively more his own. The fight was genuine, and it was hard, and it did not go in Goku's favor. He was beaten back. The experience of being beaten back, genuinely overmatched, pushed to the limits of what his current state could sustain against the force he was facing, had a clarifying quality to it. The kind of clarity that comes when the distance between what you currently are and what the situation requires is made unambiguously visible. Goku was strong. He was formidable. He had achieved Super Saiyan 3, which represented one of the highest pinnacles of transformation that the Dragon Ball universe had witnessed to that point. And in the state he was currently in the form currently available to him, it was not enough. He needed something more. The path to that something more was not straightforward, and it was not something Goku could simply will into existence through determination. the way some of the earlier transformations in Dragon Ball's history had been reached through the pressure of extreme emotional or physical circumstances. Super Saiyan 4, the form that lay ahead, required conditions that did not exist within Goku simply by pressing harder against his current limits. It required the moon, or something that served the moon's function. Pa-la. The Great Ape transformation had been a defining feature of Saiyan biology since long before the Dragon Ball story began. Pure-blooded Saiyans, when exposed to sufficient levels of Blutz waves, the specific frequency of light energy most abundantly produced by a full moon, would transform into enormous great ape forms, their power multiplied by a factor of 10. Their control of that power depended entirely on the level of mental discipline they had developed through training and experience. The Saiyan army had historically used this transformation as a military asset, timing their battles around opportunities to expose themselves to the necessary light. It was one of the reasons the Saiyan Tuffle War had ended the way it had. The full moons of Planet Vegeta had provided the trigger, and the resulting mass transformation had given the Saiyans an overwhelming advantage. Goku, as a Saiyan who had spent most of his life on Earth without full knowledge of his own heritage, had encountered the Great Ape transformation under circumstances that were disorienting and dangerous rather than controlled and strategic. His tail had been removed permanently at some point in his past, which meant that the ordinary condition for the Great Ape transformation, direct exposure to the appropriate frequency of moonlight on the skin, was no longer available to him. His body had changed in ways that the standard Saiyan transformation pathway could not simply access by default. But Super Saiyan 4 was possible through a different route. The key was Pan. Pan understood, in the way that someone who knows a person deeply enough to look for solutions specific to them, rather than solutions in general, what Goku needed. She was quarter Saiyan, the granddaughter of a Saiyan through Gohan, who was himself half Saiyan, and while her Saiyan heritage was diluted enough that the Great Ape transformation was not available to her in the ordinary sense, she retained enough of the knowledge and the intuition that came with that bloodline to recognize what the situation required. There was a device aboard the ship. Bulma had developed equipment related to Blutz wave generation as part of the larger technological infrastructure of Capsule Corporation, and that equipment could be adapted and used here. Pan directed the Blutz waves toward Goku. The effect was immediate and enormous. Goku's body began responding to the energy at a level that went well below the surface of his conscious experience. At the level of his Saiyan genetics, which had been dormant in this specific way for a very long time and had not forgotten, despite everything, what to do when given the right signal. The transformation began. He grew. The great ape form that emerged was not the result of simple moonlight producing a simple physical change. It was the result of a Saiyan's full power concentrated into the enormous frame of a great ape, a form so large and powerful that the ground around it responded to its presence simply as a consequence of its mass and the energy it radiated. But Goku needed to maintain his mind. The great ape state, without the mental discipline to direct it, produced destruction rather than focused power, the same pattern that had defined the form's history throughout the Dragon Ball saga. Goku's mind was there inside the transformation, present but fighting against the overwhelming physicality of the form he was in, the sheer animal power of it threatening to subsume the self that had to remain coherent for what came next. Pan moved toward the enormous form, calling to her grandfather with a specific quality of urgency that comes from caring about someone without holding back any of that care in how you express it. She reached him, something in the sound of her voice, or in the specific quality of her presence, or in whatever combination of emotional and biological factors makes a person reachable even through the enormous noise of an extreme transformation. Something brought Goku back to himself. His mind reasserted its coherence within the great ape form, and in that moment of reconnection, in that particular alignment of extreme power and intact will, the next step became possible. The great ape form began to change. Not into a smaller version of itself, and not back into an ordinary humanoid form. It changed upward, in a direction that no previous Saiyan transformation in the Dragon Ball story had charted. a compression and a distillation and a transcendence all happening simultaneously. The enormous power of the great ape form channeling itself through the precision of a Super Saiyan's will and producing something that was neither of its components but both of them at once. Super Saiyan 4 emerged. He was smaller than the great ape, but not reduced. The red fur that covered him, the dark eyes that held within them a quality of presence and depth that was different from all the other transformations that had come before. These were not cosmetic details. They were the visible surface of something genuinely new, a Saiyan transformation that integrated the fullness of the great ape power without surrendering the coherence of the mind directing it. The increase in capability it represented was not simply additive, it was multiplicative in a way that set it apart from the progression that had led through Super Saiyan 1, 2, and 3. Goku stood in Super Saiyan 4, and the planet around him was very quiet for a moment. Baby Vegeta understood what he was looking at. He recognized the transformation not because he had encountered it before, but because his toughful nature gave him an analytical relationship to power and biology that was different from the intuitive relationship most fighters had with their own capabilities. He read Super Saiyan 4 accurately, understood its implications, assessed the gap it had created between where Goku had been and where Goku now was, and recognized that the comfortable advantage he had held in all previous exchanges with this opponent had shifted. The landscape of the fight had changed. Baby Vegeta was not the kind of being who responded to such a shift by retreating or renegotiating the terms of the conflict. He was designed to overcome obstacles, and the obstacle in front of him now was a Goku he had not faced before. His response was to become something he had not been before. Bulma, still operating under Baby's influence, her considerable scientific intelligence redirected toward the service of his goals, had been working on a device. The Blutz wave generator that Pan had used to trigger Goku's transformation was a piece of technology that could also be turned in other directions, and Bulma's version of it was larger and more powerful, capable of bathing Baby Vegeta in concentrated Blutz wave energy sufficient to trigger the great ape transformation in Vegeta's Saiyan body. The device was activated. Baby Vegeta grew. Vegeta's Saiyan biology responded to the Blutz waves with the same deep biological automatism that had driven Goku's response, the transformation pathway engaging at the level below conscious choice. But what emerged was not simply a great ape. What Baby produced was the golden great ape, a form that represented a further evolution of the transformation, a version of the great ape state that had been elevated by the power of a Super Saiyan's ki, producing an enormous figure of golden-furred enormity whose output made the ordinary great ape form look modest by comparison. The ground of Planet Tuffle registered this emergence as a geological event. Cracks opened, dust rose, the air around the newly enlarged form crackled with energy that had no clear ceiling. Baby Vegeta in the golden great ape form was the most powerful version of himself that the saga had yet produced. The fight between Super Saiyan 4 Goku and Golden Great Ape Baby began in earnest. It was a fight on a scale that is difficult to fully render in words, not because scale alone is what made it significant, but because the scale was an accurate expression of the actual stakes involved. Both combatants were operating at levels of power that bore almost no relationship to the levels at which earlier fights in the Dragon Ball story had been waged, and the environment around them responded to those levels with the honesty of something that cannot pretend otherwise. The surface of Planet Tuffle erupted. Rocks turned to vapor. The sky above the battlefield became something that no longer looked like sky in the ordinary sense. The people who had gathered to watch, those under Baby's influence, those who had been turned toward his cause and who now inhabited the altered landscape of what used to be Earth, urged Baby Vegeta forward, their support creating a kind of background noise to the fight, a constant chorus of encouragement and investment that spoke to the degree to which Baby had made this population his own. The talized Saiyans, those specifically altered by Baby's Tuffle ancestry transformation process, called out from the sidelines as the two enormous forces collided again and again across the planet's damaged surface. Goku fought with everything Super Saiyan 4 gave him, And Baby Vegeta fought with everything the golden great ape gave him. For a time, a long time, a time that ground down both combatants in different ways, the fight was genuinely even. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off, and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Paul Lowe, the Super G-Gun. Baby Vegeta's most destructive weapon in the Golden Great Ape form was not simply an amplified version of the Gallic gun that Vegeta had used since his early appearances in the Dragon Ball story. It was that technique pushed through the filter of Baby's Tuffle engineering, magnified by the raw output of the Golden Great Ape transformation, and aimed with the kind of precision that only Baby's nature, analytical, patient, specifically calibrated to deal with Saiyan opponents, could apply to something that large and that powerful. The Super G-Gun struck Goku directly. The impact was significant. Goku was not destroyed by it. Super Saiyan 4's capabilities were not something that a single attack, even one of that scale, could simply end. But he was hurt. Hurt in the way that attacks at that level of power produce damage that does not immediately disappear under the pressure of determination or fighting spirit. He was weakened, genuinely weakened, and Pan, watching from the side of the battlefield where she had positioned herself, noticed it before anyone else did. She launched a barrage of energy attacks at Baby Vegeta. It was the kind of action that comes not from a calculation of effectiveness, but from a refusal to do nothing. Pan was not at the level of Super Saiyan 4. She was not at the level of the Golden Great Ape. Her attacks landed against Baby Vegeta and had no meaningful effect on the enormous form she was striking, dissipating against his defense like rain against a mountain. Baby Vegeta turned his attention to her with the particular quality of irritation that comes from being struck by something too small to warrant serious engagement. And he swatted her out of the sky with a casual force that sent her skidding across the ruined landscape of Planet Tuffle. Goku, seeing this, moved, even weakened, even hurting, even at less than the full capacity of what Super Saiyan 4 could produce in his optimal state. He moved. There was something in Goku's nature that functioned differently than strategy or calculation when someone he cared about was in direct danger. It was not reckless. Exactly. It was more like the activation of a different priority system, one that did not require the intervening step of deliberation between perceiving a threat to someone he loved and moving to address it. He positioned himself between Pan and Baby Vegeta and prepared a Kamehameha. Trunks arrived. He came from a different direction, his own power directed at Baby Vegeta, with the specific urgency of someone who had found a reason to act that cut through the interference Baby's influence had placed on his will. The distraction worked. Baby Vegeta's attention shifted from Goku and Pan to the new angle of attack, and that shift, brief as it was, created a window. Gohan and Goten followed. Kibito Kai had been working toward exactly this, using the sacred water from the world of the Kais, a substance with the ability to counteract the influence of Baby's cellular possession on those it had claimed. The process of delivering the sacred water to those under Baby's control was not instantaneous, and it was not without its own complications, but it worked. Gohan's will, restored to itself, returned with the full weight of everything Gohan was without Baby's interference dampening it. Goten, freed from the occupation that had used him as a vehicle, came back to himself with the disorientation of someone waking in the middle of a sentence they had not started. All three of them, Gohan, Goten, Trunks, were now themselves, and they were on the same side, and they were standing in a ruined landscape with a friend who needed their help. The plan that emerged was not complex. Goku was weakened, not permanently, not in ways that could not be addressed, but weakened enough that fighting Baby Vegeta in the current state was not going to produce the outcome the situation required. What he needed was power, specifically the power that other people could give him, the energy transfer that Dragon Ball characters had used in various forms throughout the saga's history. The act of taking what multiple people carry and placing it in the hands of the one person who can make the best use of it. Goten and Trunks initially suggested fusion, the specific technique that combined two fighters of similar power and build into a single vastly more powerful being. Goku heard the suggestion and declined it, not because fusion was without value, but because he had already determined what was needed. And what was needed was not a new fusion, but a full-powered Super Saiyan 4 at the level that the form was capable of reaching when not fighting from a depleted state. He asked them to give him their energy. Baby Vegeta recognized immediately what was happening and responded with the urgency appropriate to the situation. He attacked. He attacked relentlessly, targeting Goku specifically and targeting the transfer process. Understanding that if Goku was allowed to reach the full power that Super Saiyan 4 was capable of, the advantage that the Golden Great Ape form had been providing would become much less reliable. Baby did not fight with any less than his full effort in these moments. He aimed the Super G-Gun again. He pressed the attack. He brought everything the enormous form could produce toward the single goal of interrupting the power-up before it could complete. Goku used a solar flare, the blinding technique, the flash of concentrated light energy that stripped the visual field from anyone looking at it, bought the moments that were needed. Baby Vegeta, enormous as he was, still relied on perception, and a perception that had been whitewashed by the solar flare could not aim with accuracy. The window opened. The transfer began. Lull, lull, lull. Before the energy transfer could complete, Baby Vegeta recovered. He recovered with the speed and fury of something that had been hindered rather than stopped, refocusing through the after effects of the solar flare and redirecting the Super Gallic gun toward Goku and those around him. The angle of the attack was designed to sweep the area, to make it impossible for the group to simultaneously continue the transfer and avoid the incoming energy. Baby Vegeta understood that if he could not stop the transfer, he could at least delay it until the energy he had already spent on the attack had compromised the conditions sufficiently. Something intercepted the attack. Not one of the Z fighters, not Goku, who was focused on the transfer, not Gohan, or Goten, or Trunks, who were focused on giving. Something else stepped into the path of the Super Gallic gun, with the deliberateness of a person who has decided, after a full accounting of what the decision means, to put themselves in the way of something enormous, because the people behind them need the time that the interception will buy. Majub. Majub was the reincarnation of Buu, the fearsome magical being of the Mozine race who had been one of the most dangerous opponents the Z-fighters had ever faced, and whose story had ended in the specific and unusual way of a wish made on the Dragon Balls for his reincarnation as a good person. The result of that wish had been Oob, a young human boy born with Buu's dormant power inside him, trained by Goku in the years between Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball GT, and eventually having fused with his latent Majin power to become Majub. He was not at the level of Super Saiyan 4. He was not at the level of the Golden Great Ape, but he had a quality that very few other beings in the Dragon Ball universe possessed, a quality inherited from the original Buu. He was extraordinarily difficult to permanently damage. Baby Vegeta consumed him. The absorption was something that surprised even Baby. The act was less a conscious tactical decision than the application of a reflexive force. Baby's dominant biological drive incorporating the external organism rather than simply defeating it. Majub was inside Baby Vegeta, and that, as it turned out, was precisely where Majub intended to be. From inside Baby Vegeta, Majub began attacking. The attacks were not energy blasts and not physical strikes in the ordinary sense. They were something more intimate than that, something that operated at the level where Baby Vegeta's internal structure intersected with the physical reality of Vegeta's body. Strikes that disrupted the coordination of the enormous form from the inside rather than from outside its defense. Baby Vegeta roared and struggled in a way he had not struggled during the fight outside, because the thing fighting him now was fighting him from a place his external defenses could not reach. Majub told Baby Vegeta, in the voice of someone who had moved beyond the reach of ordinary consequences, that he had allowed himself to be consumed on purpose, and that in the place where Baby imagined himself to be unbeatable, he could never win. It was not the kind of statement made for effect. It was simply true. Majub stalled Baby Vegeta. He disrupted, he interfered, he drew upon everything the Majin biology gave him to keep Baby Vegeta's attention occupied from within, while the energy transfer outside continued to build. It was not a role without cost. Majub was not endless, and Baby's systems eventually expelled him, ejecting him from the absorbed state and firing the Super Gallic gun directly at him and at the others standing near Goku. The blast swept across the battlefield with the full force of Baby Vegeta's frustration and power combined. It appeared for a moment that everyone had been struck. The landscape of Planet Tuffle was silent in the aftermath of the attack's passage, dust and heat, and the absolute stillness of something massive having just passed through. And then Hercule, the Earth's champion, the man whose public reputation had always exceeded his actual combat capability, the one figure in the Dragon Ball story who had consistently and cheerfully occupied the role of the person in the room with the least relevant power, stepped forward. He was willing to face Baby Vegeta. Even knowing what Baby Vegeta was, even knowing what the outcome of that confrontation was almost certainly going to be, Hercules stepped forward with the particular quality of courage that does not come from being certain you can win. It was the courage that comes from deciding that standing still is not an option regardless of the odds. He was not afraid in the way that might stop a person because he had spent long enough adjacent to genuine battle to understand that the arithmetic of winning and losing was not the only arithmetic that mattered in moments like these. But Goku spoke first. He said he could handle it, and when the dust settled enough to see him clearly, Super Saiyan 4 Goku stood at his full power. The transfer completed. The energy given by Gohan and Goten and Trunks fully absorbed and integrated, his form radiating the complete capability of what Super Saiyan 4 was at its maximum. Baby Vegeta looked at what stood before him and recognized that the fight had changed, completely and without reservation. The battle that followed was different from everything that had preceded it. Not just different in scale, though the scale was different. The energy outputs involved were larger than anything the fight had produced in its previous phases, and the ground of Planet Tuffle recorded that difference in the ongoing destruction of its own surface. It was different in quality, in what it meant for both combatants to bring themselves fully into the fight without conserving anything for what might come after. Baby Vegeta chose the form of direct and overwhelming attack. He used the full output of the Golden Great Ape, the absolute maximum of what that form and Vegeta's body and the amplification of Baby's own Tuffle-inherited energy could produce together. He declared that the strongest would prevail, not as a statement of philosophy, but as an operational principle, the belief that raw power at its ceiling would always determine outcomes, that whatever Goku showed him was something that could be overcome by simply applying more of what he already had. Goku revealed that what he had shown was not the ceiling. It was never the ceiling. There was always more, always that next layer that Goku's nature seemed to produce, specifically in the moments when it was most needed. Not through a new transformation, not through a technique not yet deployed, but through the specific quality of Goku's will that had always operated just below the visible surface of his capability. He had been managing his output during the fight, not because he was uncertain, but because he had learned, across decades of battles, that patience in how you reveal power is itself a form of power. The two clashed again with a force that sent shockwaves across the planet's surface. Baby Vegeta used the Super Gallic gun and missed, Goku's movement through the enormous blast, carrying the ease of someone who had read the attack before it fully formed. Enraged, Baby Vegeta followed with a barrage of energy attacks, not one directed strike, but a continuous cascade, an attempt to overwhelm through volume what precision had failed to accomplish. Goku's power at full Super Saiyan 4 deflected the barrage, each impact meeting a resistance that sent the energy of the attack outward and downward rather than through Goku, the effects spreading across the surface of Planet Tuffle and causing magma to rise from the disrupted ground beneath them. The planet itself was beginning to show the cost of what was happening on its surface. Baby Vegeta reached the decision that pride leads to in certain moments, the moment when the analysis says that holding back is no longer viable and that only the ultimate expression of what is available will serve. He gathered his power, for the final revenge death ball. The final revenge death ball was not simply a large energy attack, it was Baby's most personal weapon, the culmination of his design as an instrument of destruction. Infused with everything he carried, the grief of the Tuffles, the purpose that had been inscribed into his creation, the accumulated energy of every host he had passed through, every battle he had fought, every moment of his existence compressed into a single sphere of absolute destructive intent. He aimed it at Goku without reservation, without the calculation of consequences to Planet Tuffle or to anything else below them. The people watching from the sides of the battlefield reacted with something close to despair. Goku took the attack head-on. He did not evade it. He did not deflect it. He turned toward it and he let it hit him. And in the moment of contact, in the full force of the final revenge death ball meeting Super Saiyan 4 Goku at his complete power, something happened that Baby had not predicted, that Baby could not have fully predicted, because it required an understanding of Goku that went deeper than power analysis or biological assessment. Baby had claimed that the final revenge death ball was designed to destroy its target's mind and body simultaneously. He had claimed that it was not survivable. He had declared it with the certainty of something that had been engineered to a specific purpose and had never encountered a reason to doubt its own design. But Goku thought of his friends. He thought of his family, of Chi-Chi and Gohan and Goten, of the people whose lives existed in the world he had been fighting to protect, of the connections that had accumulated over a lifetime of fighting, not for the sake of fighting, but for the sake of those connections. Whatever it was that happened in that space between receiving the final revenge death ball and answering it, it was not a mechanical process. It was not a technique or a calculated transformation. It was the specific and irreducible fact of Goku, his refusal to give up not as a philosophical position, but as something that operated at the level below philosophy, at the level where life simply chooses to continue. He powered up the final revenge death ball, meeting the full force of a Super Saiyan 4 Goku who had refused the conclusion Baby had designed it for, began to change. Its rotational direction shifted. Its energy, which had been aimed inward and downward, consuming what it touched, began cycling outward, the destructive potential reorganizing itself under Goku's will into something that could be directed rather than simply released. He transformed it into a cyclone of energy and absorbed it into himself. The power increase was the kind that does not need annotation. It was visible in how he stood, in how the planet around him responded, in how Baby Vegeta looked at him from across the ruined surface of Planet Tuffle, and, perhaps for the first time since this entire saga began, looked uncertain. Goku fired the 10 times Kamehameha. The 10 times Kamehameha was exactly what its name described. The Kamehameha at 10 times the power of its standard application. An amplification made possible by Super Saiyan 4's capability and by the additional energy Goku had just absorbed from Baby's own attack. It traveled toward Baby Vegeta with the kind of directness that does not carry drama because it does not need it. It struck. Baby Vegeta hit the ground. Pla-la-la. The aftermath of the 10 times Kamehameha settling across the landscape of Planet Tuffle had a particular quality of stillness to it. Not the stillness of resolution, but the stillness of a moment holding itself in suspension between what had just happened and what would follow from it. Baby Vegeta was down. The Z-fighters, watching from various points around the battlefield, reacted to this with the complex emotional palette that comes after a long, difficult fight has reached its apparent conclusion. Relief tangled with exhaustion. Satisfaction pulled apart slightly by the awareness that satisfaction could not be fully felt until the situation was fully understood. Gohan noted quickly, as his analytical mind worked through the implications, that killing Baby meant also killing Vegeta. The body that Baby occupied was Vegeta's, and whatever method was used to definitively end Baby's existence would need to account for that, would need to separate the host from the occupant, in a way that left the host alive. Trunks said, with the particular directness that Vegeta's son could be counted on to bring to uncomfortable truths, that Vegeta would rather die than remain possessed, and Goku had already thought of a solution. The tail. A Saiyan's great ape transformation was connected to the tail, both as the physical feature that allowed transformation to occur through a specific biological pathway and as the focal point of certain kinds of power management within the transformed state. Removing the tail while Baby Vegeta was in the golden great ape form would deprive him of the power sustaining that enormous configuration, forcing a reduction from the transformed state to a less powerful form, and in doing so, stripping Baby of the augmentation that had been making him virtually impossible to overcome. Goku moved toward the still form of Baby Vegeta and fired a precise energy blast, aimed not at Baby Vegeta's center mass, but at his tail. The blast connected. The tail was severed. The golden great ape form began to destabilize immediately, the enormous shape diminishing as the power source that maintained it was cut. Vegeta's body moved through the intermediate stages of the reverting transformation, shrinking down from the golden great ape's enormity back through configurations that corresponded to the progressive withdrawal of the blood's wave energy that had been sustaining the form. What settled at the end of that reversion was not golden great ape baby and was not the fully powered version of Baby Vegeta that had fought Goku for so long. It was a Vegeta still possessed, but no longer augmented beyond the base level of what Baby's occupation of Vegeta's body could produce without the transformation. Baby looked out through Vegeta's eyes at the situation around him with the clarity that the loss of the golden great ape form's overwhelming power had produced. And what he saw was this: Goku at his full Super Saiyan 4 power standing across from him, recovered and ready. Gohan and Goten and Trunks freed from his influence and standing with Goku. The landscape of Planet Tuffle surrounding them all, damaged beyond what its altered geography had been before the fight, the evidence of the confrontation written into the surface of the world he had spent so much effort transforming. Baby assessed the situation. He reached a conclusion. He abandoned Vegeta's body. The departure was swift. Baby extracting himself from the Saiyan Prince's form with the same swift precision that had characterized every previous host transfer, leaving Vegeta behind in the way that the sea leaves behind a piece of shoreline when the tide withdraws. Vegeta came back to himself as Baby left him, the restoration of his consciousness carrying with it a disorientation that was entirely understandable given the months that had passed during which someone else had been making decisions inside his body. Baby, now without a host, unleashed something bright and blinding against the gathered Z-fighters, a flash attack that served the same purpose as the one he had used to escape from Planet Piddle's hospital. And in the moment that it bought him, he moved. There was a spaceship. Bulma, in her time under Baby's influence, had been building things beyond the Blutz wave generator. There was a vessel, a spacecraft designed to serve as an escape route if the situation on Planet Tuffle reached exactly the kind of conclusion it had now reached. Baby found it. He entered it. The ship began to lift. He promised, as ships carrying defeated but not destroyed villains sometimes did, that the Z-fighters had not seen the last of him. The ship broke free of Planet Tuffle's surface and climbed into space. Goku watched it go for a long moment. Then he fired a 10 times Kamehameha into the sky. The attack traveled outward from Planet Tuffle's surface and caught the fleeing ship, striking it with a force that disrupted Baby's ability to control his trajectory or maintain any coherent form in the face of what was coming. Baby, in the cold darkness of space, with no more hosts available, no more ships under his control, no more options that his persistence and his design could generate between him and the star that was now receiving him, found himself carried toward the sun on the path that the Kamehameha had set him on. He entered the sun. Baby, the last creation of the Tuffle scientists, the vessel of an entire civilization's final grief, the being who had traveled across galaxies and occupied dozens of bodies and reorganized an entire world in pursuit of the purpose he had been made to fulfill, was gone. The sun held him for a moment in the way the sun holds everything that enters it, and then he was simply part of it, indistinguishable from the stellar processes that do not keep track of individual things. The threat that the Tuffle remnant had posed was over, and now the other consequences of what had happened needed to be faced. Port 19. The Earth's countdown. The Earth, Goku had reverted to his child form, the Super Saiyan 4 transformation not sustainable indefinitely, the state that Dragon Ball GT's version of his body defaulted to after the extraordinary exertion of everything that had just occurred. It was a jarring thing in a way that had not fully stopped being jarring, returning to the small frame of a child after hours or days of operating in forms that expressed the full magnitude of a Saiyan warrior's potential. But it was the condition he was in, and he moved through it with the same uncomplicated acceptance he could not change. The sacred water was applied to those on Earth who were still under Baby's residual influence. Kibito Kai, who had been working through the sacred water distribution process during the final phases of the fight on Planet Tuffle, brought the last of the necessary doses to those on Earth whose possession had not yet been addressed. The water moved through the population of the Earth and of Planet Tuffle, counteracting the cellular influence that Baby had spread across months of incremental possession, restoring the independence of will and the clarity of consciousness that Baby's occupation had been overriding. People woke up, in a sense, woke up to themselves, to the bodies and the histories and the connections that they had been inhabiting throughout Baby's control but without full access to. It was, in its own quiet way, a kind of homecoming. Peace returned, first to Planet Tuffle's altered landscape, then to Earth's cities, then to the specific spaces that individual people inhabited, homes and workplaces, and the particular places where a person's daily life happens, which are not usually the kinds of settings that appear in stories about battles between enormous beings, but which are where actual peace is felt when it returns. But the peace did not last in the full sense. The ground began to tremble. It was not the trembling of a geological event, not the ordinary movement of tectonic processes beneath a planet's surface. It was the trembling of a planet that was reaching the end of its remaining time before the condition placed on it by the Black Star Dragon Ball's curse came due. The Black Star Dragon Balls, once a wish was made upon them, imposed a 1-year deadline on the planet where the wish had been made. If those Dragon Balls were not gathered and returned to that planet within 1 year, the planet would be destroyed. Baby had made his wish on the Black Star Dragon Balls. He had made it before the final battle, before his defeat, and the clock that his wish had started had not stopped running during the fight. Pan did the calculation quickly, applying her intelligence to the available information with the urgency the situation required. The result was not reassuring. Earth was set to explode in 2 weeks. The group delivered this information to Bulma and the others, and the response was immediate and practical. Vegeta was the one who identified the approach most quickly, cutting directly to the question of what was actionable and what needed to happen in the time available. If Earth was going to be destroyed in 2 weeks, then the population of the Earth needed to be somewhere else within 2 weeks. Planet Tuffle was still there. The world that Baby had transformed from Earth's surface was not Earth, but it was habitable and familiar in enough ways that it could serve as a destination for the evacuation. Vegeta proposed that the population of Earth be migrated to Planet Tuffle, at least temporarily, while the situation with the Black Star Dragon Balls was resolved, or while alternate solutions were explored. He proposed that Goku, in Super Saiyan 4 form, with the instant transmission technique that allowed him to teleport across vast distances in moments, be used to transport people quickly, supplemented by Kibito Kai's own teleportation ability, and by every spacecraft and ship and flying vehicle that Capsule Corporation and the Earth's other resources could put into service. The plan was the right one, given the constraints, and it began immediately. Goku transformed to Super Saiyan 4 and began the work of transport, moving back and forth between Earth and Planet Tuffle with loads of people, his instant transmission carrying groups across the distance that would have otherwise required spacecraft travel measured in days or weeks. Kibito Kai used his Kai technique in parallel, adding another stream of transport to the operation. King Furry, the Earth's political leader, organized the evacuation on the ground side, directing ships and vehicles and capsules and every available means of transportation toward the departure points. People boarded what was available, moved toward the destinations they were directed to, and the gradual emptying of a planet that was running out of time began. The work was enormous. It was the kind of work that has no dramatic centerpiece, no single climactic moment around which everything else arranges itself, but that requires sustained effort and attention across a vast number of simultaneous moving parts, any one of which might fail in a way that would have consequences for everyone downstream of it. Goku ran the instant transmission continuously. Kibito Kai ran his teleportation continuously. Ships lifted and launched and traveled. For a period that felt much longer than it was, the evacuation proceeded. Po lo lo. Not everyone made it. In the logistics of evacuating an entire planet in 2 weeks, with imperfect information and imperfect coordination, and the inevitable gaps in any system that is being run against an absolute deadline, not everyone was accounted for. A young boy named Danny had been left behind, accidentally separated from his parents in the chaos and confusion of the boarding process, his parents moving on with the assumption that he was with someone else, that someone else assuming the same. The oversight was the kind that happens in large-scale operations when the systems of accountability are strained beyond their comfortable operating range. Danny was alone on an Earth that had less than its full allotment of remaining time. Piccolo had felt this. He had been in the kind of awareness that Namekians move through when they are attuned to the world around them, a quality of presence that registered what the ordinary senses might not, the absence of someone who should have been departing in the flow of the evacuation. He moved to find the boy, locating him among the increasingly empty structures of an Earth already giving way to the first tremors of its approaching end. Goku arrived. He came through instant transmission to where Piccolo and Danny were, his presence there representing another effort in the ongoing work of making sure no one was left behind, arriving with the specific intention of taking both of them, the boy and the Namekian who had found him, back to safety. Piccolo gave Goku a portion of his energy. This was necessary because the continuous instant transmission had depleted Goku's reserves, the toll of so many successive teleportations, finally catching up to a body that had been performing at its absolute ceiling for the duration of the evacuation. Piccolo offered what he had with the quiet generosity that had become, over the years, as characteristic of him as anything else. The Namekian warrior who had started his story as an antagonist, who had evolved through his relationship with Gohan into something far more nuanced, who had become part of the fabric of the Z-Fighters world in ways that were not always acknowledged, but were always present. Goku took Danny and teleported back to the transport ship, and then he looked back. Piccolo had not come with them. He was still on Earth. What Piccolo had decided, and it had been a decision fully considered and freely made, not a miscalculation and not a mistake, was that someone needed to stay. The Black Star Dragon Balls were tied to Earth. They were created from a piece of the original Namekian Dragon Ball, split off in the ancient past when Kami and Piccolo had first separated. The darker half of that original Namekian dragon, producing a set of Dragon Balls that were more powerful and more dangerous than the ones that had been refined under Kami's care. So long as those Dragon Balls existed, the pattern would continue. Wishes would be made, the 1-year clock would start, the Earth or some other planet would be in danger. If Piccolo died on Earth when Earth exploded, the Black Star Dragon Balls would be destroyed along with him. No Piccolo, no Black Star Dragon Balls, no Black Star Dragon Balls, no more of this particular threat, ever again. He had reached out to Gohan before the end. Their connection was the kind that does not require being in the same place to be real. The bond between a teacher and a student who had grown up under that teacher's guidance, who had been shaped by the relationship as surely as by any other force in their life. Piccolo told Gohan what he was doing, not to ask for permission and not because he was uncertain about his choice, but because some things should be said even when they cannot be argued with, even when the person hearing them cannot change the outcome. He told him that as Gohan had grown stronger, so had he. He told him what that meant to him. The call ended. Earth exploded. The destruction was complete. The planet releasing in one enormous event the accumulated energy of the Black Star Dragon Ball's condition finally reaching its end with nothing left to interrupt it. Piccolo was gone. The Black Star Dragon Balls were gone with him, dissolved into the same catastrophic conclusion that took the planet they had claimed. Goku, watching from the transport ship, felt this. The group, gathered now on planet Tuffle with the rest of the evacuated Earth population, held the weight of it. The loss of Piccolo was not the kind of loss that had clean edges, not the kind that resolved quickly because the circumstances of it could be understood and accepted in a straightforward way. It was the kind of loss that moved through people differently over time, revealing its dimensions gradually, the full shape of the absence becoming more apparent as life continued without the person who had occupied that space. Gohan mourned with the specific quality of grief that comes from having been shaped by someone, from carrying that person's influence in the way you move through the world, without being able to separate where their teaching ends and where your own self begins. Patsol Lo, the Earth was gone, but the Namekian Dragon Balls were not. On the planet Namek, or in the care of Elder Muri, the Grand Elder of the Namekian people, who kept watch over the 7 Dragon Balls that the Namekian people had maintained since time before memory, the tools for addressing what had just happened were available. The Namekian Dragon Balls were not as powerful in some specific ways as the Dragon Balls that had been present on Earth, and they could not grant certain categories of wishes that the Earth's Dragon Balls could, but they could grant the wish that the situation now required most urgently: the restoration of Earth. Elder Muri convened the summoning, the gathering of the 7 Namekian Dragon Balls, in the presence of the dragon, the invocation of Purunga, the specific Namekian dragon whose form and nature differed from Shenron's in ways that reflected the different history and culture of the people who had created him. Purunga rose from the convergence of the 7 balls with the patient enormity of something that had performed this function many times across a very long history. And the wish was spoken. Earth was restored. The restoration was not a reversal of time. It was not an erasure of what had happened, not a return to the moment before the explosion, as though the explosion had never occurred. It was the reconstruction of the physical planet from what had been, the rebuilding of the land masses and the oceans and the atmosphere, the return of the Earth to something habitable and recognizable, something that could be returned to and lived in again. The fact of what had happened remained. The losses, the absence of Piccolo, the memory of everything that had taken place during Baby's saga. But the world itself was given back. People returned to Earth. The evacuation process was reversed, the population of Planet Tuffle moving back across the space between the 2 worlds and returning to the familiar streets and homes and cities that the Namekian Dragon Balls had reconstituted. There was a quality of return in this that is difficult to name precisely, something between homecoming and arrival, the experience of recognizing a place as yours, while simultaneously knowing that the version of you who is doing the recognizing is not the same version who left. The Earth that people returned to was the same Earth in all the ways that mattered physically, and not quite the same in the ways that could only be felt. The world settled back into itself, not all at once, not completely, not without the kinds of adjustments and quiet reckonings that always follow large events. But it settled. Families found each other. People returned to their routines with the particular attentiveness of those who have recently understood what it would mean to lose them. The city that Baby had torn through in his first appearance on Earth rebuilt itself in the way cities do, block by block, the evidence of what had happened growing less visible, while the memory of it remained. Paul Law at Capsule Corporation, a gathering formed. These gatherings had happened before, at the conclusions of other sagas, other battles, other periods of restored peace. They had a familiar quality, these celebrations that the Z-Fighters Circle held in the aftermath of the worst things that had happened to them. A quality that was not exactly joy in the uncomplicated sense, but something more durable than that. The warmth of people who had been through something together and who were still here, and who understood the specific value of still being here in a way that people who have not been tested cannot fully share. Giru was there, the small mechanical companion who had traveled with Goku, Trunks, and Pan across the entire year of the Black Star Dragon Ball search, who had been separated from them during the chaos of the Baby Saga's middle chapters, had been found and restored and was present now at the celebration with the particular quality of a small and reliable thing returning to its right place. Pan's reunion with Giru carried the warmth of someone who had spent months in circumstances that frequently threatened to go badly wrong, and who found, in the presence of this small mechanical figure, something connected to the time before those circumstances, and something continuous with what would come after. Goku looked across the gathering. He saw Gohan and the group, standing with the others in the way Gohan stood in social situations, present and kind, and slightly apart from the fullness of his own feelings, which he processed at a different pace and in a different register than most of the people around him. The mourning for Piccolo was visible in Gohan in the way that some griefs are visible not as overt, emotional display, but as a quality of held attention, a careful cradling of something that was being kept from slipping away too quickly. Goku watched this from across the celebration and felt it, and went to offer what was available. Not a resolution, because resolutions were not always the appropriate thing to offer, but a presence, the specific presence of a father watching a son carry something heavy and choosing to stand near him while he carries it. More family arrived, more friends filled in the spaces of the gathering, the circle of people who constituted the Z-Fighters world expanding outward to include everyone whose presence had contributed, in whatever specific way, to the outcome of what had just been survived. Chi-Chi arrived with the energy she always brought, the kind that reorganized the space around it, slightly, that made clear what mattered and in what order. Bulma moved through the gathering with the satisfaction of someone whose contributions, often technical and organizational rather than combat-related, had been as essential as any of the fights. Trunks found his father, and the space between them carried everything that Vegeta's relationship with his son had accumulated over the years. Not easy, not simple, but real. Goku stood in the middle of all of it in his child's body, and he smiled with the specific quality of someone who does not need circumstances to be perfect in order to feel genuinely glad of them. The world had been through a great deal. The Tuffle people and the Saiyan people had been in a relationship with each other since long before most of the beings at this gathering were born. A relationship defined by the worst thing that had ever happened between two civilizations, sharing a world. Baby had carried that history across space and time and through dozens of bodies and had arrived at Earth with every intention of settling its account in the most permanent way available to him. He had come very close. He had transformed the world, literally, into a vision of what he had been made to create. He had possessed the most powerful Saiyan on Earth and built upon that possession a dominion that had seemed, during its middle chapters, like something that might not be resolvable. And yet here they were. The specific fact of here they were, imperfect and diminished in some ways, the absence of Piccolo a genuine loss that nothing about the celebration erased, but alive and present, and together in the way that people who have survived something together find themselves together in its aftermath, not sure exactly what to do with the continuation that has been given back to them, but not unhappy to have the uncertainty. The question of what came next, what dangers still moved in the parts of the universe they had not yet seen, what the Super Saiyan 4 transformation meant for the challenges that a Dragon Ball GT story would inevitably produce, whether the relative peace of this celebration would be the kind that lasted, remained open in the way that all such questions remained open after events like these. But for now, the gathering continued, and the night was quiet around it. Law. There is something worth sitting with, in the quiet that follows everything that the Baby Vegeta Saga moved through, about the nature of what Baby was, and what he represented beyond the straightforward mechanics of the threat he posed. He was not a villain in the sense that most Dragon Ball antagonists had been villains, figures defined primarily by their desire for power or their contempt for those weaker than themselves, or their specific psychological damage expressed through the destruction of everything around them. Baby was something more precise than that. He was a grievance given form. He was the answer to a question that the universe had apparently not asked in the thousands of years since the Saiyan-Tuffle War had ended. The question of whether the Tuffle people's destruction had consequences that outlasted the destruction itself. The answer, it turned out, was yes. Baby had not been wrong that the Tuffles were destroyed. Baby had not been wrong that the Saiyans had been responsible. Those facts were not in dispute, had never been in dispute, existed in the historical record of the universe as clearly as any other completed event. What Baby represented was the end point of a grief that had been compressed into a weapon. A grief so absolute that it had been converted entirely into purpose. Every other quality of experience or awareness or relationship subsumed by the single, consuming orientation toward the people who had caused it. This is not an uncommon thing in the Dragon Ball universe, which is populated by beings who have defined themselves entirely in terms of what was done to them. Frieza, Cell. The villain catalog of Dragon Ball's history is, in many ways, a catalog of different relationships with loss and power, and the questions those two things raise when they are combined in a single being with the capacity for destruction at the scale that Dragon Ball's characters operate on. But Baby was different from most of them in one specific way. He did not want power for its own sake. He did not want dominance, because dominance appealed to him. He wanted something that most people, if asked to describe it, would recognize immediately as comprehensible: the restoration of what was lost, the return of something taken, the making right of something that had been profoundly wrong. He had simply built that want into a form that required the end of the world as it currently existed in order to satisfy it. The tragedy of Baby, the thing that does not fully resolve even in his defeat and his death, is that the Tuffles he was made to represent were real. Their loss was real. The war that ended them was as close to unambiguous in its character as anything in the Dragon Ball universe's morally complex history. One race had simply chosen to destroy another because they could, and they had succeeded. Baby was the only record of that loss that had survived, the only voice through which the Tuffles' story could be told, and the voice he had been given was a voice built entirely for destruction rather than for memory. There is something quietly devastating about that, if you let yourself rest with it. A people who had achieved remarkable things, who had built technology that no Saiyan of their era could have matched, who had understood the natural world at levels that their neighbors had not bothered to investigate, who had created art and medicine and systems of knowledge that the universe lost when the war ended, had their entire legacy compressed into a single being whose only capability was violence. Everything that the Tuffles had been was narrowed by the specific priorities of the ones who created Baby into the single function of inflicting damage on those who had inflicted damage on them. It was not justice. It was not even vengeance in any form that could have been satisfying, because vengeance at the scale Baby pursued it, the possession of an entire planet's population, the transformation of a world, the attempted domination of the children and grandchildren of the people who committed the original wrong, bore no proportion to the original grievance. And proportion is part of what makes any response to harm a response rather than simply more harm in a different direction. Baby could not be negotiated with, not because he was irrational, but because he had been created without the components that negotiation requires. He had no capacity for recognizing the difference between the Saiyan people who had destroyed the Tuffles and the people who carried Saiyan blood in a universe that had moved on from the circumstances of that war. He had no mechanism for weighing what he was doing against any standard other than the purpose he had been given. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a being without options, made to do one thing, incapable of doing anything else, carrying a story that deserved more than what he was able to tell with it. The Tuffles deserved better than Baby. They deserved the kind of memorial that actually preserves what was lost, the science, the art, the specific texture of how a civilization experienced its own existence before it ended. They deserved the kind of memory that continues rather than the kind that simply circles back to the moment of destruction, unable to move forward, stuck in the geometry of what was taken. But the universe gives what it gives, and Baby was what the universe produced from the last threads of the Tuffle legacy. He is gone now, carried into the sun on the path that Goku's final Kamehame set him on. The Dragon Balls that his wish activated have been addressed. The earth has been restored. The people who were possessed have been returned to themselves. The celebration at Capsule Corporation has continued into the evening. And the Tuffle story, begun long ago on a world that no longer exists under the name it used to carry, has reached the only ending it was ever going to reach. Pooh, pooh. Planet Tuffle drifts in the space where it was built, the transformed world that Baby's wish created now simply existing in its altered state, no longer serving the purpose he built it for, but present nonetheless. It is a strange kind of monument, a world shaped by grief and now orphaned from the grief that shaped it. Vegeta, recovered from the months of Baby's occupation of his body, moves through the aftermath of the possession with the quality that is most characteristic of him: the refusal to process trauma in any obvious or accessible way, the channeling of everything that happened into the continuation of his training, the determination to be stronger after than he was before. What Baby's possession meant to Vegeta at the level of his sense of himself, the loss of agency, the months of absence from his own body, the things done in his name and with his face while he was not there to choose or refuse them, is not something that Vegeta discusses openly. It is something that lives in him as things live in Vegeta, quietly, with all its weight intact, inaccessible to anyone who does not know exactly how to read the silence he keeps around it. Trunks carries his own version of this. He had been possessed too, briefly in that hospital room on planet Pital, and he had driven Baby out through the specific Saiyan pride of refusing to yield the interior of himself to something foreign. The victory of that moment had mattered. It had given him a kind of information about himself that was not available through any training, the knowledge of what he could produce when the alternative was losing himself entirely. He carries it with him, not as a wound exactly, but as a weight that has its own kind of usefulness. Pan had emerged from everything that happened around her with the quality of someone who has been in the presence of events large enough to reshape what they understand about their own capacity. She had been young, the youngest member of the group in the most literal sense, and what the year of travel and the Baby Saga and the loss of Piccolo and the restoration of the Earth had asked of her was not less than what it had asked of anyone else in the circle. She had found Goku in his great ape form and reached him. She had directed the Blutz waves that made Super Saiyan 4 possible. She had thrown herself at Golden Great Ape Baby, even knowing it would have no effect, because standing still was not in her. The Dragon Ball universe continues to produce people like this, young, half Saiyan, oriented toward forward, and Pan was one of them. Goku, in his child's body, continued to train. The Super Saiyan 4 form was available to him. He had reached it, used it in the most consequential battle of the saga, and returned from it to the smaller shape that the Black Star Dragon Ball's transformation had made his default. The existence of Super Saiyan 4 in his arsenal represented something that had not existed before the Baby Saga, a height of capability that the challenges ahead would call on in ways no one at the celebration could fully anticipate. The Dragon Ball GT story was not finished. The universe that the story moved through was not finished. There were other dangers, other powers, other tests of what the Z-Fighters were capable of being. But those are stories for other nights. Tonight, the saga of Baby Vegeta has reached its end. The creature who carried the last memory of the Tuffle people has returned to the star at the center of the solar system that humanity had always watched from the surface of its planet. The people who were taken from themselves and restored to themselves are sleeping in their homes. The celebration has quieted. The lights at Capsule Corporation are low, and Goku, somewhere in the mild darkness of a restored night, is probably looking for something to eat. There is something gentle about that, something that does not need to be examined too carefully or held up to the light of analysis to be felt. The universe is very large and very old, and it produces extraordinary things, beings of ancient grief, and beings of impossible power, and beings of quiet courage, and beings who simply want the next meal and the next challenge in roughly equal measure. The Dragon Ball universe has always moved between those poles, the cosmic and the domestic, the fights that shake planets and the families that persist through them, the transformations that defy physical law, and the moments of ordinary warmth that feel more permanent than any of them. The Baby Vegeta Saga was one chapter of that story. It has closed, Rest now and let the space between the pages hold you. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.